All right, everyone. Well, we will go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for Winter Nature Challenge 2020. My name is Brian Taylor, and I'm the educator with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. We are excited once again to offer this engaging program to the community to keep people active and engaged for a chilly winter. Well, what's supposed to be chilly winter. A fantastic lineup. If you're here, you probably already have seen the schedule of presenters and topics, so please stay tuned. Every video will be recorded and will be put on YouTube and made available if you happen to miss one or need to catch one later. So, but this year it is the Winter Nature Challenge is a partnership between the NSRWA and Mass Audubon. And so I'm sure you're probably familiar with both of these organizations, but I work for NSRWA, and we have been 51 years of protecting land and water for all the animals and all the people that go along with it. So through lots of education, advocacy, community programs, partnerships, just like this one, we work to preserve and protect one of our most valuable resources, that being water. And so we do a lot of work throughout the watershed area, from Hall all the way down to Duxbury, and through partnerships with Mass Bays. We work from Hall all the way down to Plymouth. And so the watershed and the surrounding watersheds are all working together to preserve and protect something that is so crucial to people and to all of life. So through programs like this, in the watershed's mind, the more people who are active, engaged in nature and environmental education, the more likely they are to want to connect with that, and the more likely they are to want to preserve and protect that's which is important to them. So, so just for being here, you're supporting that and you're supporting our organizations, and we thank you for that. So I'm going to pass it on over to my co-host here with me with Mass Audubon, Doug Lowry. Go ahead, Doug.
Thank you, Brian. And it is such a pleasure for Mass Audubon to partner with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. You talk about a nonprofit that started out small with big ideas, and where they've come in that time is impressive. People that have questions about watersheds, other watershed organizations quickly turn to the North and South Rivers Watershed Association for mentorship, for answers to difficult questions. And that's a testimony to just how strong and important the North and South Rivers Watershed Association is to our community, and well beyond our community and our watershed. So we're so grateful that we can do this every year with them. As you know, Mass Audubon, basically what Brian just said is kind of our mission statement as well. We're kindred spirits. We welcome folks to check out our website. The whole pandemic has been given us an opportunity, a silver lining, if you will, an opportunity to kind of reflect on our mission, to spend a little time writing a pretty aggressive action plan for the future, including adding 10,000 acres to our already 40,000 acres of land preserved in Massachusetts by the year 2025. And so it is part of a kind of a revitalized organization, and we welcome you to participate in where we're going, and appreciate every one of you in your support. And yeah, we're looking forward to this whole 8 weeks, and Brian and I will co-lead some of the presentations, And tonight you're in for a treat. For those, I won't do a formal introduction, but for those who have seen Blake present, you know that's why you're here. he's great. And for those who haven't seen his presentation, you will quickly become a fan. He's very informative and very entertaining. So Blake, why don't we hand it over to you, or back to Brian?
Yep, go ahead, Blake. I'll allow you to share your screen, and you can go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Brian. And thank you everyone for joining and tuning in. I really appreciate being able to participate in these winter nature challenges. They're a lot of fun, and I know Mass Audubon and NSRWA do a lot of good work. So we'll start with a brief introduction of who I am. I'm Blake Dinius, and I work for Plymouth County Extension. This is me. I'm at the top of Mount Washington here, and I assure you I climbed all the way to the top. I did not drive my car or take the train up there. I hiked all the way up. I really like spending a lot of time outside and doing a lot of things in nature. That's kind of one of my favorite things to do. But prior to this, you know, what I currently do now, I used to work with honeybees. And so that's really where a lot of my research was in, is just working with bees, and mostly honeybees. But in my current role, I work as an educator serving Plymouth County. So I work for the members of Plymouth County. And so it could be anything from school programs to leading walks to going into libraries. I like all of it. It could even just be an email someone sends me on identifying stuff. I dealt with a lot of people who are dealing with issues in their garden, and they send me a lot of questions on how they can help grow tomatoes or grow whatever they're trying to grow, or maybe just have an interest in they saw something interesting and they wanted to have that identified. So I'm your guy if you really want to have if you have those questions and you want them answered. But you can really just think of me as just a giant bug nerd. I've been a nerd my entire life. I don't really care too much about what people think. I just really love what I do. And I go out there and I really like exploring the world around me. So we're going to talk today about insect declines. And I know it's kind of been a hot topic. It's not as hot as it was about 2 years ago, one and a half to 2 years ago, but it's still something that is very much on the forefront of my mind. It is something that has not really gone away since the New York Times posted their giant article on the insect apocalypse. But I do want to talk about how important insects are. I want to start off with that. And I love this quote from the late E.O. Wilson, who's seriously one of the best entomologists that kind of ever walked the earth. And he referred to insects as the little things that run our world. And I really like to think of them like that. They're these things that are working on in the background of our lives, that are keeping our lives going. And we don't even really see them half the time. They're taking care of all the maintenance that allows us to live the kind of lives that we live. So for instance, like I think you guys might already know this, but 80% of flowering plants depend on insects. And just to kind of give an idea of how important the relationship between flowering plants and insects are, I really like this graph showing what was a recently published study from 2021 on the impact of flowering plants on insect diversity. And they're calling it the angiosperm terrestrial revolution. And you can see these the red box I have there just kind of highlights the expansion. Basically, the wider the bar is, the more species there were. And you can see like Coleoptera, which is beetles, got way wider as soon as this happened. You can see like the Hymenoptera, which includes bees, also really expanded a lot. And you can see just how impactful and how intricately tied flowering plants are to insects. Insects and birds are really important. So if you like birds, I hate to say it, you have to like insects, because the things that you like to watch are dependent on insects. 60% of birds rely on insects for food. Insects play also really helpful roles in controlling pests. This is a fly. You may not like the appearance of it, but it's really, really important, and I'll tell you why. This fly, called Sizenus albicans, there's no common name for it yet. This parasitizes winter moths. And so for people who don't really like winter moth, this is the fly that you can thank for controlling winter moth populations. Now, winter moth it's not going to go away completely, but you will see about a 40–50% reduction in winter moths in areas where this fly is established. And that's pretty significant. And it's just a really beautiful fly that we believe is not really impacting anything else except for winter moth and maybe a native moth called Bruce spanworm, but maybe not as much Bruce spanworm. Insects have really essential roles in nutrient cycling. If you ever kind of drive down the road, you kind of see these squirrels or maybe some roadkill on the side of the road, you kind of wonder where it goes sometimes. And a lot of times the insects really decompose this stuff very, very quickly. And we really have them to thank for kind of taking out our trash. And this is just a quote from this study from 1989, where they talked about insects exposed, like when animal carcasses were exposed to insects, they lost about 90% of their weight in 1 week. But when they were covered with a mesh cloth, they only gradually dried out and they mummified in greater than 100 days. And over 100 days, they never fully decomposed. So you can think about that, like how many like if you think about like Walking Dead or like zombie apocalypse, right? Like, where are the insects? If the insects can decompose these things that quickly, that's the question I always ask when I'm watching like zombie movies is, where are all the insects? They never explain that. In particular, poop. Like I know you think about like, where does the poop go? Where, everything poops, but where does it go? We really have insects to thank for decomposing that, taking advantage of that resource that we consider waste products, the insects consider a resource. And in this study from 1960, they found that just a single cow, if there were no dung beetles that could decompose the cow's poop, a single cow could decrease the effective area of a pasture by 20%. And that's pretty significant. And that's actually what happened in Australia, where they introduced cattle, but they didn't have the proper dung beetles that could decompose cattle dung. They had all evolved, the dung beetles in Australia had all evolved on different animal species. And so they actually, it was a huge deal because they were pretty much buried to their knees in poop. And so they had to quickly find a dung beetle that would decompose the poop of the cattle they had imported into Australia. So that's where this came from. Kind of an interesting story about what happens if you don't really pay attention. People don't really know how much insects are doing until they don't have them anymore. There are about 20, insects are incredibly diverse. There are about 26 orders of insects. And I just have a chart here, kind of a number of pictures showing the different kinds of insects. And I do want to spend some time talking about some insect orders that I consider particularly significant, especially when we're dealing with water systems like the North and South Rivers Watershed Association deals with. You got your dragonflies and damselflies, really charismatic species that anyone can go and observe dragonflies and damselflies, and they're really, really fun group of insects to kind of get into. We have about 460 species in North America. They're important predators, including mosquitoes. Everyone hates mosquitoes, so if you hate mosquitoes, then you should love dragonflies. But they're also really important art, culture, even involved in fishing. Your stoneflies, really important. There's about 670 species in North America. They're predators, detritivores, or they feed on this thing called periphyton. And this is kind of an interesting thing that I learned, is that if you look at kind of slimy, kind of moss covered, or not really moss, but like algae covered rocks, that can take a lot of time for that algae to develop on a rock that is in a water system. Now these stoneflies will feed specifically on those plants growing on those rocks. And so if you were to walk on those rocks and scrape off those plants, you'd be harming these stonefly species that rely on feeding on those plants. They also some of them dwell in this thing called the Hyporia Zone, which is kind of a really fancy sounding word, but it's this really important zone that embodies around a water system, that is around a water system. So it's like the ground below a water system. It is filled, it's still moist. It's like kind of, you think about like the mud underneath a river, like that would be maybe the Hyporia Zone. These dwell in it. And so you can think of anything that might be impacting these stoneflies, might impact the Hyporia Zone and vice versa. So they have really important roles in water quality. And as a fly fisher, I think stoneflies are super important. You always kind of want to match the hatch when it comes to stoneflies. The hemipterans, the true bugs, cicadas, hoppers, aphids, and allies, about 10,000. They're predators, plant feeders, some are blood feeders, some are significant plant pests. We want to look at this one on the top right here called the spotted lanternfly, that one in the middle of the top. Now, this is one that if you don't know about yet, you're going to want to get to know about this one. This one is pretty darn important. And we can cover that one at a different time, but that's a big one. Spotted lanternfly. If you don't know it yet, look it up. Beetles, really important. Beetle, I know we have a non-native ladybug species here that I'm showing, but a lot of them are super important. 25,000 species. They're really diverse. Predators, fungivores, plant feeders, pretty much you name it. We went over how they're really important decomposers on poop and animal carcasses and stored product pests and parasites. Your ants, bees, wasps, and sawflies, again, really important, about 18,000. I have a little asterisk there because we believe, and this is kind of one of the thoughts, is that they may be the most diverse order of all insect orders. We think that for every insect that exists, there must be a parasitic wasp that parasitizes it, or a parasitoid wasp that parasitizes it. So they may be more than double of all the other insect species in the rest of the world. They're very diverse, very widespread. You know how important they are for pollination, but also super important biological control for different pests that kind of get into our country. Your caddisflies are really important filter feeder species, predators, detritivores. There's this interesting thing that they may even be ecosystem engineers. So the way they form their cases or the way they form these webs kind of tie sediment together and clump sediment together. And we think that that may form water, help form with the structure of water systems and the ability for water systems to avoid storm damage, for instance. Like if there was a storm that kind of came through, that area tied together with the, if you think about many millions of these caddisflies living along a river system, and they all have these cases and these webs that are tying that sediment together, might be more resistant to storm damage. So, butterflies and moths, you know, we like them because they're pretty, they're super popular. Some are plant pests, but for the most part, we just like them because they look cool. And lastly, I wanted to cover your flies, because the flies, I know a lot of people think of them as being house pests, but they do pretty much everything that all the other orders do. They're predators, they're parasites, they're detritivores, they break down animal carcasses, they're pollinators, they're biological control. You can use them for water quality, they spread disease. I mean, your mosquito here is the most deadly animal in the entire world. It amounts for the most number of human deaths of any animal in the entire world. So they're a very, very significant order. So you can see that insects are super important to the way that we live our lives. And the number of undiscovered insects is even more shocking. There's at least 1 million on the lower end, but on the higher end, there's potentially over 30 million undiscovered insects in the entire world. Now, when you compare that with mammals, there's only about 300 mammals left undiscovered. So you think about 300 mammals, and at the very bare minimum, there's about 1 million undiscovered insects. Very, very shocking. You know, mammals, when we talk about the percentages that each group of animal makes up of all animals, mammals only make up less than 1% of all animals on the planet. Birds are less than 1% of all animals on the planet. Reptiles, same. Amphibians, about 0.5% of all animals on the planet. Fish, 2.5%. Insects make up 77% of all animal life. So if you call yourself an animal lover and you don't like insects, I hate to say it, but you're a hypocrite. But what's interesting about this is even though insects make up the majority of all animal life, conservation has always, as general rule of thumb, has been biased in the favor of vertebrates. And I like to take this quote from this study. We may never know how many invertebrate species are at risk because, again, conservation is biased in the favor of vertebrates. If you were to Google right now, you Google endangered species, you're only going to see furry vertebrate creatures that pop up on Google. And you're going to think, oh, pandas, oh, rhinos. And yeah, I do feel bad for them, you know, snow leopards, these things. I do want to preserve and protect those animals, but they make us a small fraction of all the endangered species that we have on this planet. I mean, most people, you know about the blue whale, the endangered blue whale, but how many people know about the endangered Carner blue butterfly? Not too many people, right? And you can look at the decreasing range of this Carner blue butterfly. It used to be here, you know, in eastern Massachusetts, right? That the historic, or no, sorry, it used to be here in New England. The historic range, you know, extended into like New Hampshire, and now it's very drastically decreased. What's interesting about this is it's not just the host plant. Like, you know, you think about monarchs, oh, we might as well plant milkweed and that's how we're going to get the monarchs to come back. Well, the range of this Carner blue butterfly, you've got areas where its host, this wild blue lupin, right, is greater than the current range of the Carner blue butterfly. And we're not really sure why it's declining, why it hasn't taken back some of these areas that we've replanted its host. It's probably dealing with some factors that we still have yet to understand. But again, it's kind of a cool butterfly that I wish could reclaim some lost territory, some lost ground. So the big thing about why I want to talk about insect declines is that, well, how do you know how to protect something if you're not actually looking, right? If you don't act, how do you know if you're not looking? If you're keeping your head buried in the sand, how do you know what's missing? In 2017, we got this wake-up call, and so I think it woke up a lot of people. You know, in the past before this, you had colony collapse disorder right around the 2010s, 2008 to about 2012. People talked about colony collapse or disorder. They started wearing out bees. Before that, you had monarchs. You're worried about monarchs and milkweed. It just, even today, we're still worried about bees and monarch butterflies. But in 2017, we got this wake-up call because this study was published in Germany. It was a 27-year study, and that's kind of like the holy grail when it comes to studies in ecology. This long-term study, and what they found is a greater than 75% reduction in biomass of flying insects. And that was just kind of really kind of made people sit up straight. It made people like really kind of open their ears, because before this point, people had kind of noticed this. They had all this anecdotal evidence. They said, well, I'm driving my car and I see fewer insects on my windshield. Well, what does that mean? I mean, cars have become more aerodynamic as they've developed. They become rounder. Our windshields are more curved. So maybe that was causing fewer insects on the windshields. We weren't really sure. But this study kind of made people think like, okay, it's not any of these other things. Like this is something we really need to pay attention to. This is some really serious stuff. And what was kind of cool about this study, not really cool, but in a good way, but really intriguing, especially as a scientist, was that these were considered protected lands. They were areas where they weren't spraying heavy pesticides. They were fragmented landscapes, but they weren't very contiguous, connected parcels of land, but they hadn't been exposed to like heavy pesticide use. It wasn't like they were agriculture or a suburban neighborhood or an urban city. They were considered protected, conserved land. So this caught media attention. So the New York Times, they posted this study. They said the insect apocalypse, they called it the apocalypse is here, like as if insects were all of a sudden completely going to be gone. It says, what does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? And I tell you, my heart skipped a beat when I saw this. I got really scared. And they had this, and then it was crazy. They had all these things come out, like, New York, insect apocalypse is here, and BBC News, global insect decline may see a plague of pests, plummeting insect numbers threaten collapse of nature. Collapse of nature. That's what the Guardian published. And so this got like so much attention, and it really spread awareness. Now, I know scientists in the community, some really liked this. They liked the attention they got, and other scientists thought that this might be more like a kind of like a false alarm. Like maybe they were like, it's just too much hype. I mean, they wanted to kind of tease apart this, kind of settle everyone down and really pick apart what was actually going on. Because after all, it was only one study, right? So this triggered, well, the good thing that happened out of all this media attention, same thing with colony collapse disorder, is that this triggered a number of additional studies. Because as soon as that happened, people really, really were stimulated. They won't, funding came in, people really wanted to figure out what was going on. Scientists got really interested in this. And one particular study that I really want to call attention to was this review that was published in 2019. It was talking about the worldwide decline of insect fauna, and they talked about its drivers. And this one got even more attention. This is kind of a crazy study. And the first thing I know as an entomologist reading this, I said, well, this study is kind of junk. But it really got the attention of the media, and that it was something that became really hard to control. So what are some things that they brought up? They said the rate of decline in insects was 2 times that of vertebrates. The pace of extinction in insects was 8 times higher than vertebrates. And 1 in 3 insects were threatened with extinction, and that about 1% of insect species were added to the endangered species list each year. And about half of insects in North America were declining. So they painted this picture that was far, far worse than anything that we had really thought of before. It was this very alarming, very shocking thing. But the thing about science, and what you kind kind of grow to love and hate is that as soon as you discover something new, you get everyone else saying, well, actually, you didn't really do this, you didn't do X, you didn't, even though you've got the peer review process, you got a whole ton of people that are like, well, by the way, your 5-year study should have been a 10-year study, and you looked only at bees. Well, what about beetles? And you did it only in Massachusetts. Well, what about New Hampshire? And like, that's just kind of the way it goes. But the big thing about these studies is that they were good, but they were incredibly flawed, and it was really hard to draw conclusions, especially conclusions about global insect trends off of these studies. For instance, this German study, for instance, half of the sites were only sampled once. So if you think about it, even though it was a 27-year-long study, you only looked at one location one time, and then you looked at another location in another year. And so if you saw maybe, let's say, for example, if you saw 100 bees in 1 year at one location, and you looked at a completely different location, you saw half, how do you call that a decline, right? You would have to follow the same location year after year in order to figure that kind of thing out. But they didn't do that in this study. Studies that were sampled in multiple years were not done in consecutive years. So what if 1 year it was rainy and 1 year it wasn't? You know, if you're looking only at insects that respond to maybe a bloom and flowers, and that first year you sample that site, there's this huge bloom and flowers, you get a lot of insects. The second year is right after a drought. How do you know? You're not really sure. They measured biomass. So what they did is they trapped insects, they killed them, and then they weighed the weight of those insects. And that's not the same as abundance, because what this doesn't take into account is the type of insect, right? So let's say at the start of the study, it was mostly heavy beetles, right? And at the end, it was mostly really light flies. Well, you could have the same number of insects, but maybe they've just changed. Maybe they've changed to become different insects. You can't really measure that with this study. And then again, they were considered protected locations, but they were fragmented and they were embedded in agricultural landscape. So again, the study was great. It was 27 years long. It was really good. It really raised alarms. It really let us know. It was that wake-up call. But there's still something, you can't draw a global conclusion off of just this one study. And then that review study, probably the biggest critique of it is that they only, the way they designed that study is they only searched for studies that included the word insect and decline in them. And while you're looking for insect declines, what this means is that you're actually cherry picking the data. So it means that you're omitting studies that might show the opposite of what's in that study. So it might, they omitted studies that might show that insect populations were stable, for example. They omitted studies that might show that insect populations were increasing. And so when they were talking about all these insect populations disappearing, they never looked at ones that were staying the same or ones that were increasing. And that was probably the biggest flaw. And then they took data occurring from primarily the United States and Europe, and they said, what's happening here must be happening in other parts of the world. So what's happening in the United States must be happening in Africa, or what's happening in Europe must be happening in South America. And that is kind of an interesting, I take a lot of issue with that. I mean, it's possible, I'll give them that much, but to say it's happening, I don't really know about that, right? And then again, there was no baseline data. They didn't know what they started with. So how do they know things were actually decreasing? So let's fast forward. So we talk about those studies, kind of like the negatives of those. Let's fast forward. What is going on currently now when it comes to insect decline? So those were the studies that were published a few years back. What is happening? Well, super complicated now. So it's not this clean picture that the mainstream media kind of painted. It's not this clean picture that insects are disappearing and that we're all going to die. It's a really convoluted, messy picture. So this one review that was published in 2020, they mostly looked at North America and Europe because that's where most of the data came from. They looked at 166 studies with data spanning from 9 years to 80 years. And what they found is actually a little bit different than some of those studies that came before. What they found is that terrestrial insects, so insects that are on land like your butterflies, were decreasing about 1% per year, so about 10% every decade. And aquatic insects were increasing, on the other hand, about 1% per year. So overall, it was a net equal. Like nothing was, insects overall were pretty much staying the same, but the aquatic insects were increasing. So this was really good information because it let us know and like a little bit more about the picture, right? It painted a better picture of what was going on. And what's kind of interesting is the fact that aquatic insects were increasing. And what they think it's linked to is actually how much we've started caring about our water system. So you can really thank the North and South Rivers Watershed Association right here. Thank you, NSRWA, for protecting our water systems, because this has had an impact on aquatic insects. And they think it has everything to do with clean water, right? That's why so it was a hopeful picture, right? That we started to reverse this trend in insect declines by protecting these water systems. And it really made me think maybe the same could be true for terrestrial insects, maybe. There's another study published in 2020, primarily in Europe. They found a similar thing, that freshwater insects had increased in diversity. So the numbers of different kinds of insects had gone up, but not necessarily the numbers of insects. They kind of stayed the same. So it was a little bit different than what was going on in that previous study. But again, they showed that terrestrial insects had gone down. And so in Europe, that was what they were seeing. So again, kind of thank you, people that are conservation organizations protecting water systems. I'm not sure what their analog in Europe is for NSRWA, but they certainly have something if their freshwater insects are increasing in diversity. And then there was this one that really made everyone scratch their head, where they looked at this study. They looked at 15 long-term ecological research sites for 4 to 36 years, and there was no evidence of any decline in insect abundance. So it's like, okay, well, we started to understand what was going on. And then all of a sudden this study comes out and you're like, well, what? So it's not that any of these studies are wrong per se, but they tell you a little bit, they tell you something different about the story. And the trick is figuring out how they all work together to paint the picture of what is actually going on. So what's happening, you know, and the other thing about these studies is they kind of raise the alarm of the focus, the recent focus of all insect studies really has been Europe and the United States. The vast majority of all of our long-term data comes from Europe and the United States. But Europe and the United States are estimated to only have about 20% at most of the global insect species diversity. So we're focused on this area where most global insect diversity, it doesn't exist. So we want to know what's happening in the rest of the world. And there are now, thanks to all of the prior work, there are scientists looking at all this. They've got the funding now. They're starting to do this kind of work, and it's great. And remember, right, that there are many, many more insects out there that we don't know about. You know, again, at least 1 million undiscovered insects, maybe 30 million undiscovered insects. And this I like this graph taken from this study in 2021 that analyzed the number of studies that belong to each insect order. So you can see Lepidoptera, that's the pretty butterflies, have about 60,000 different studies looking at them, right? Beetles, about 40,000 studies looking at them. And then you go down the list and you find that all the other order, you have this category, other orders. And that's just everything else that they've lumped in that. All the things like Hemiptera, like maybe my favorite insects, the true bugs, like your shield bugs and stink bugs and aphids, they're considered other orders. It's just kind of a crazy thing to think of, that they're really, we don't know a lot about insects. It's not like mammals, right? It's not like mammals where you can walk outside, or birds where you can walk outside and look at all the different birds, or look at all the different rabbits you have in your yard, squirrels. Insects can be really, really hard to find, really, really hard to see. They have these very complex life cycles. They're really, really hard to study. But what's great is that now people are seeing that, and they're seeing how important it is to study these things. And then there are insects that we know about that we still don't know enough about. It's like this forceps fly, it's called Merope tuber. We have no idea how this thing reproduces. No one has ever figured it out. Like all of the entomologists in the entire world have never figured out how this forceps fly reproduces. It's a mystery. We're absolutely uncertain. We can't get it to reproduce in laboratory settings, so we have no idea. And so what that means is, like, how do you even preserve that? How do you even, if you don't know how this forceps fly reproduces, how do you conserve it? Well, you got to study it better in order to preserve it. And so again, these studies really generated enough press, enough hype, enough funding to really get people to do these things. So is the insect apocalypse upon us? Is this thing really, really happening? Are we destined to see all the insects disappear in our lifetime and end up walking around in deserts around in all of our conservation land? Well, the truth is that we really don't know enough to be sure. I don't think we can draw any conclusions off of those previous studies that kind of were published in mainstream media. What we do know is that there's really good evidence that insects are in trouble, right? That we're seeing declines, maybe not in global insect populations everywhere on every single insect species, but we're seeing declines on important insects, on insects that were once common. We're seeing declines on insects that we really love, like your bees and your monarchs. And we need to know why. We need to know why that's the case. And I think that's really what we want to get out of this so I want you guys right now to think less like the world is collapsing all around you and there's nothing you can do about it, because the message that this sends, this gets people, again, to return to burying their heads in the sand, to sticking their fingers in their ears, to covering their eyes, because it paints this catastrophic world where you just don't want to do anything about it, right? You feel like there's nothing you can do. This sense of hopelessness that everything's going to die. And I want you to step away from that, because we don't know if that's true. What I want you guys to think more like is that this is our relationship with nature, right? Our relationship with nature, right? It is a little bit rocky right now. It does have some kinks. We need to work on it. We need to kind of get through it. And these studies have really highlighted that. They've really called attention to all these things we need to work on, but we're still in this relationship. It's still there, and there is still hope. So if we've learned anything from these studies, it's not necessarily that science is always flawed, but it's that how little we actually know about insects, that we know so little about them. I mean, we talk about, like I see in the news all the time, people want to explore Mars, they want to develop Mars, they want to go to all these different planets, right? But we have an amazing planet right here that we know practically nothing about. And so I think we just start at home. Why build a rocket ship to go to space when you can start at home? So what I want you guys to do is make 2022 the year that we learn more about insects, right? The year that we kind of forge, that we kind of repair that relationship that we have with insects, that we've neglected them, we've forgotten them, we don't pay attention to them. And so 2022 is the year that we start to pay attention to them, that we start to give them the consideration, because they are supporting us. So when we talk about drivers, things that we think are causing insect declines, well, this idea of good earth keeping, it's kind of a play on good housekeeping. You guys already know about this stuff. I mean, I'm not going to go too far into this. Reduce pesticides, cultivate native plants, remove invasive species, support your conservation organizations. Again, thanks NSRWA, and I should throw one out there from Mass Audubon too. All these guys doing great work out there. Do all these things. When we think about like the drivers that are causing insect decline, they all go back to these things. We've known this for decades. Habitat loss causing insect decline, deforestation, fragmentation, intense agricultural, monocultures, all these things that are driving insects down. Pollution, and in pollution you can include pesticides, even fertilizers, introduced species, climate change, exploitation, so like exploiting insects, over collecting them, or maybe exploiting them for some kind of resource. And co-extinction, so if you destroy one insect, how does all the other insects depend on that? Or if you destroy one flower, how do the bees that depend on that flower, how do they fare? And so we already know about these things. So the things you can do to protect them, they're all the same. This is not new information necessarily. You guys know these things. The thing, I do want to talk about one new thing that has kind of come up in recent years, and it's this notion that light pollution is pollution. And so a lot of times people focus on pesticides, they really harp on that, but they leave their front porch light on all night. What we've really come to learn is that light pollution is just as bad as pretty much any other chemical that you could spray in your yard. It's really, really bad, and we think it's driving declines of insects we don't even see because we're sleeping when they're out. Things like moths and fireflies really depend on there being less light. And there's actually a recent study, I don't have it linked at the bottom, but I can send it over to you, about how low light attracts more mosquitoes. So bright light and complete darkness, so the fewest are the least attractive to mosquitoes at night, and low light is the most attractive. So if you don't care about fireflies and moths, then at the very minimum, turn off your porch lights to reduce mosquito bites. And so the thing that I want to focus on the most for the end of this presentation is the importance of what you guys can do in your own backyards. So reporting sightings, super, super important. Again, a lot of these studies that were flawed, they come down to not enough information about populations. We don't know, we haven't been paying attention to them. We don't know where they are. We're not sure what the species ranges historically were. And so this is something you can actively do right now. And that data tracking these distributions of species will play a role in how much we understand about them and maybe would be used in future studies. And I mean, no, seriously, like you are really important. Let's talk about this one study that was published, back in, I think it was 2020. It's about the Pygmy snaketail, and this is this dragonfly. It's considered a fairly rare dragonfly, and it was discovered in Michigan. And you can see the shaded area where it stretches from Maine pretty much all the way down to like Tennessee, North Carolina, and you got this little satellite kind of population of Wisconsin. These people discovered this dragonfly in Michigan, which is not close to those areas. And that was kind of cool. This is kind of cool that they discovered it. What's really kind of interesting about this is that people used to think that this dragonfly only existed in pristine habitats, pristine, perfect water with no pesticides, nothing. And they actually found it in this stretch of river where they had some very serious problems with pollution up and downstream. And you can look at that really murky, silty water, and they found that dragonfly there. They found a very healthy population of it. The other cool thing about this study is that none of its authors were trained entomologists. They were not entomologists as a career. They were naturalists, just like you guys. They were doing this as a hobby. They were doing this for fun, and they were passionate about it, but they actually discovered this population of dragonfly. And now we start to ask questions about why was that there? But you think about like this person, and yeah, they have science backgrounds, right? But they weren't trained. It was something that pretty much you guys could go and do. But what's cool about this finding too is that now that we found it in this new location, we can ask questions like, how can we learn how to protect it, right? How can we learn about why it's so rare? Why do we know why it exists in this supposedly polluted area? Maybe there's a particular compound or a particular chemical that it's sensitive to in other areas that is just not there in that stretch of river. We're not really sure, but this happened because people went out there and looked and they reported it and they found it. It's real science. Citizen science really, really matters. And this is taken from a study just recently published in 2021. I like this quote, and it says, in the future, many of the richest sources of occurrence data, that's data showing insect populations, will come from community science efforts, will come from citizen science. And you can look at the growth of iNaturalist records. The insects there are more records of insects than there are vertebrates. And that really, really brought a smile to my face when I saw this, that for once the insects are winning, that they're claiming their rightful place as the dominant taxa of animal life. And that's really, really cool. And so the folks at iNaturalist are really, really doing it, people who are using that. And you can learn about mysteries happening within our own county. So you got this Compton tortoiseshell. This is a really kind of a cool butterfly. In 2021, this was seen in Plymouth County. It periodically establishes temporary breeding populations. We're not really sure how it does it. And afterward, the species can be absent for many, many years. And we saw it in Miles Standish last year. Why was it there? Why does this happen? And it was really cool that this got reported, because again, now we can start asking these questions. We found something called a Marsh lady beetle in 2020. I found this with the folks at Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance. This has not been seen in Massachusetts since 2014. It was the first reported sighting in Plymouth County. So and it wasn't like we were looking very hard. We just randomly ran into this. But because we reported it, now we know that it was the first reported sighting for Plymouth County. And then there's this insect that I've been looking for that I really want to try to find. It's called Rachonathus Americanus. It doesn't have a really cute sounding name, but it's potentially extinct. We don't know pretty much anything about its life cycle. We know a little bit about its diet. We think it feeds on leaf beetles, but we're not really sure. Maybe the willow leaf beetle, we're not really sure what it feeds on. It's a really big stink bug. It's really kind of cool. And we don't know. So we don't know until people start looking for these things. It could be right here. Someone could come in and be like, oh no, that thing, I see that thing every year. It's just sitting in my backyard, or I see that all the time. Or you may be walking through, you know, a Mass Audubon reserve or something like that. And you may come across this and be like, ah, it's a black bug. I don't really, and then, but if you're aware that this is an endangered species, that this needs to be protected, now you can be like, wow, this is really cool. I found this, and now we can help protect it. So I want to talk about, how do you get started? How can you get started? I have a few book recommendations, and don't worry, I can send you a list. You don't have to write these down. If you're just getting started in just getting into insects, these are kind of the 3 books that I would recommend the most. Insects of New York, in New England, New York is a really great starter one. Tracks and Sign of Insects. This is probably the best book you can get for this time of year, because this will tell you a lot about how to identify things like galls, for instance, in the winter. So there aren't really any pictures of insects themselves. It's all about how to look for the presence of insects without seeing the insect itself. So it tells you about like insect footprints, insect, the way that the tunnel patterns that insects leave when they bore through leaves or when they bore through wood, or again, like the galls they leave behind. So this is a really cool insect. You can, really cool book. You can go out today and you can check out what's in your backyard, even though you might not see the insects. Spiders in North America, really good. Some really good book recommendations for the most popular group of insects, the Lepidoptera, so butterflies, moths. Some of the lesser popular insects, you know, bees, ants, night-singing insects, grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets. Fireflies, this one's a really good book on fireflies if people wanted to get into that. Dragonflies and damselflies, freshwater invertebrates of North America, so that's going to include more than just dragonflies and damselflies. And the final question I kind of want to leave you with today, and this is kind of your winter nature challenge of 2022, is what are some ways you can be a better friend to insects in 2022, right? So it could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be finding insects. You could do the same thing, like plant a pollinator garden. You could remove some invasive plants around your yard. But I really want you to think about some of the good ways that you can be a helpful friend, that we've neglected this friend, right? How can you turn over a new leaf and become a better friend to insects in 2022? So at this point, I can answer any questions. I think that there are some questions in chat that I'd like to start with. So I'm going to go ahead and start with those. All right, so the first question, it comes from Doug. What would you describe as a perfect day in the field for me, and where might you go? And where you go, what might some of the insects you would be most excited to see? So a perfect day in the field is pretty much any day for me, but in general, insects, they really like to be out on days that we like to be outside. So days that are pretty much like 70, low to mid 70 degrees, mild breeze, you know, like not too, you know, sunny, because you think about insects, they don't produce their own heat. So they like these temperatures that are kind of warm, but not too hot. But there are a lot, you can go at any time of the year and you can find insects, and you can find different ones. So even though I'm going to find a larger number of species on those warm, you know, spring, summer days, I can find different ones in the fall and special ones in the fall or special ones in the winter. The insects that I'm the most excited to see actually belong to the stink bug group. And I know a lot of people, they don't like stink bugs, but I really like stink bugs and I get really excited to see them. The next question is, from Matt, and he's asking about some types of lights that towns can require that might fight light pollution, that might be beneficial to insects. So the thing that we're learning about light pollution, unfortunately, is that pretty much all light is bad. There is no light that is not bad. So blue light, red light, doesn't matter what color of the spectrum light, it's all really, really bad. And it's just bad to varying degrees. And I believe like there's just showing that like LED and stuff like that still is detrimental to insect populations. So turning off lights is the best thing you can do. I'm not sure what a good second option is. That's something that I'd have to go back and refresh my memory on what might be a better color spectrum. And it's something that's interesting too, that the notion that light pollution is bad is still kind of just starting to be researched. So we may learn that there might be certain arrangements of light or light at different times of the night and things like that that are better or blocking light in certain ways. We don't really know that information just yet. So the recommendation I have for you guys now is, as much as you can, try to turn off your lights, or try to, if you have lights in the house, try to put up your curtains so you don't leave them on.
Blake, would you mind, this is Doug, would you mind if I cut in here?
Go for it.
Very, very briefly. One thing that we recommend with the Firefly Watch program is if you feel like you need security lights, one option is to use motion detector lights. So at least they're not on all the time. Is one idea. But yes, certainly pulling your shades down, as you suggested, I think helps quite a bit as well.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Doug, and I appreciate that. Definitely good information. So the next question comes from Yvonne. It's, what are the best practices we can do to cultivate insect populations in our backyards? So kind of went back over that. It's like, reducing pesticides, native species. We're finding that invasive species they're kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of weird. I'm not going to go too far into it. I have another presentation specifically on invasives. But what we find is that most invasives, as a rule of thumb, invasive species are not good for insect populations. There are some species like wild indigo dusky wing has adapted to different types of plants and invasive plants, non-native plants. And so it used to feed on just wild indigo, but now I think it's adapted to crown vetch. And so things like that, it's kind of a weird thing that happened, and that's happening with other insect species too. And then there's this whole branch of ecology that just deals with, called urban ecology or urban entomology, where they're finding that some insect species are adapting, they're changing to urban environments. And what they tend to be these more flexible generalist species that are very adaptable, that might pollinate or feed on or exist in a wide array of habitats. And so they're more resilient to the changes that we place on them. But what I recommend for your backyard, again, reducing pesticides, that should be a no-brainer. Removing invasives. If you can ditch your lawn, the American lawn, there's a lot of stuff that the American lawn is basically a desert for all insect life. And so if you really want to help insects, try to ditch the lawn, all the fertilizers, all the stuff you do to maintain your lawn, not good for insect species. We talked about fireflies. Fireflies love tall vegetation. And so if you're cutting your lawn all the time, you're just destroying, you're literally destroying firefly habitat when you're doing that. And so try to keep it as natural as possible is probably the best rule of thumb, but do what you can. If you're someone who's grown up and you like your lawn, you take a lot of pride in your lawn, if you can create just a small section of your lawn dedicated to preserving insects, maybe just a 5 foot by 5 foot parcel of land that you just let grow and let go wild, then I thank you for that. That's the best you can do. Just do the best you can. It's not an all or nothing approach. Next question is, what would you say to a young person who says they really love insects, but isn't sure there are future professional opportunities in entomology? Thanks, Brian. There are always going to be opportunities for professional development in entomology. And human beings are inextricably tied to insects. If someone ever tells you you're never going to get, that's what people told me actually. So people told me, they said, what are you going to do with it? And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you in just a few short words. I have a whole presentation dedicated to this, but I can tell you in a few short words why it's so important. One, there's a lot of insects. Two, people don't understand them. Three, they impact us. And so anytime you have those three things lining up where people don't know about something, but it hugely impacts people, that means they're going to pay you a lot of money for it. And so it could be anything, like the Army will pay you for when it comes to like medical entomology. So, diseases spread by mosquitoes and ticks. All our agriculture is dependent on insects. There's so many different avenues. You can go into conservation when it comes to insects. There's so many different avenues for entomology. there's always going to be something. And there's basically, if you love insects, I say follow your heart. That's exactly what I did. And I never really had trouble looking for a job, even when the recession happened in 2008. Just was never really a problem for me. And so if you want to talk to me more about that, feel free to shoot me an email. And yeah, again, Doug adding brush piles help a lot too. So brush piles help a lot. So the big thing, kind of the contradiction here, and you're going to see that I might contradict myself, is that the stuff that is helpful for protecting insects is the same stuff that is helpful for tick populations. So if you want to get rid of ticks, it is the same recommendations that hurt insects. So a well-manicured lawn is a barren habitat, bad for insects, but also bad for ticks. If you've got a lot of vegetation and brush piles, good for insects. If you're leaving the leaves over the winter, good for insects, but all these things are really good for ticks too. So if you're doing these things, you don't have to stop doing them. I mean, I still do these things too, but you just have to be more vigilant about doing your tick checks and things like that. Just really be on top of it and be aware that you're going to be at higher risk for tick bites. So the next question is coming through. It's asking about, if I understand it properly, it's asking about recommendations for coastal residents to encourage native insects. It's going to be the same stuff, really. So I believe it or not, so a lot of the insects that I found were along the coast in Plymouth. So they're really cool stuff. And it's just protected land, stuff like the southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance. I looked at their property, and it's right along that coast. We found so many insect species that have not been seen anywhere in the county, and some state records too, just by looking at this protected land that is just free from, they do have kind of a lot of invasive species on that property, but they're not spraying pesticides. They keep this land contiguous, and we just looking for those insects, we found them. And so that's really kind of cool, knowing that you can do that you can just go out and look for them. And so that's the best advice I have is, first off, you can encourage native insects, but we need to actually know that they're there too. So I think bio blitzes are really important to take part in, just going out there. Different conservation organizations will lead walks. I highly recommend that you take part in those walks so that you can help observe these types of insects, get to know them. So when you see them in your yard, you can track them. I got someone sent me a picture from Wareham Land Trust on a caterpillar they saw in Wareham, and it was the first time that caterpillar has been seen in Wareham in decades. But I don't think it's rare. I think people just aren't looking. So it's you want to go and you want to find these things. I think that's super, super important. Probably one of the best ways to protect insects is to know that they're actually there. But again, the stuff is really the same that I mentioned before, reducing pesticides and promoting native plants in your yard, keeping it as natural as possible. Next question we have is, what about these companies that are spraying yards for ticks and mosquitoes? How much harm are they doing? Oh, that is a kind of a loaded question. And there's a lot of depth to it too. So when it comes to that question, thanks for that question, Sally. It's going to depend on so many different factors. It's going to depend on what chemical they're using. It's going to depend on where they're spraying. It's going to depend on what time they're spraying. It depends on so many different things. So like, there are no pesticides. What I can tell you right now, there are no pesticides that people use to control ticks and mosquitoes that are not harming some insects to some extent. If you go and you get an all-natural pesticide company to spray an all-natural product in your yard, that product is not just going to hurt ticks and mosquitoes. It will hurt everything. And they do use it because it doesn't last as long, but it's still pretty toxic. It's not non-toxic. They're using it because it's toxic to ticks and mosquitoes. But again, where they're spraying, if people who are on these regimens of spraying every single month, that's not so great. But people are treating for grubs also really bad. The same stuff that used to treat ticks and mosquitoes, it's the same class of compound used to treat for grubs. So it's just on a different part of your lawn. And so that's also really bad. So I think that at least in terms of the data we're looking at, you're gonna find people who will tell you that it's not really doing too much harm. But what we really, the real answer to that is we don't know how much harm it's doing, which doesn't mean it's not harming things. We just don't know how much harm these sprays are doing. And I have to believe that the harm that I think some of the private companies are doing are great. They're happening on a different scale. So like a lot of times people get up in arms about what the state is doing, the aerial sprays, but that's much more infrequent than some of these private companies that are coming out and treating like every month or so. So I hope that answered your question. Again, I'd be happy to give you more data or go more in depth if you're not satisfied with that answer. Have any more questions? If not, then I hope you guys all enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks so much, Blake. Once again, just absolutely thrilled with all the information that you provided, especially answering some fantastic questions. I'll give it just a few more moments. If anyone has some last minute questions, I will say Blake and I will be leading a guided walk this Sunday from 10 to 11:30. You will all be emailed more information about this. This will be a property in Pembroke, which we did a walk at last year and had some amazing success, especially in the aquatics invertebrate department. So if you're interested, it'll be for a small group, first come, first serve. It is a free event. You will all be emailed more information on that if you'd like to register for that.
So we had, thank you, Brian. We had one question come in as you were kind of giving that information. It's from Michelle, and she's asking if, she says she has a lot of ash trees that have been harmed by emerald ash borer, and she wants to know if there's anything we can do about it. This one is like one of the questions that really pulls at my heartstrings, because emerald ash borer is like, one of the insects that is not talked about with emerald ash borer is that there's this really cool beetle. It's called Dinius, the Eastern Hercules beetle. And we don't know what it feeds on as an adult. We know it feeds on rotting wood as a larva, as a grub, but we think it feeds on parts of ash as an adult. And so this species may be completely dependent on ash trees. And so if ash trees become extinct or extirpated in our area, then you're going to say goodbye to Dinius, the Eastern Hercules beetle. And it's a beautiful beetle. And I just am so upset about it. But the unfortunate thing is, as a homeowner, there's not too much you can do about emerald ash borer other than just report your sightings. If you see it, to the state, report it to Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. And that's pretty much it. I mean, you can treat that tree, like if it's just a single tree you want to save, it can get treated with some pesticides, but I mean, that's not really the best answer that we can really talk about. There is a lot of research right now going on about maybe releasing some biological controls that might help protect the trees against emerald ash borer, or breeding a resistant strain of ash. There are some, what we find is about, I think it's about 1% of ash trees are resistant to emerald ash borer damage. And so we can try breeding those. There's all this talk about it. It's really a race against time. Time is not on our side when it comes to emerald ash borer, and there's really very, very little a homeowner can do. Again, don't move firewood. That's a big one, but that kind of not moving firewood is kind of the thing that you should never do anyways. We actually think that that's what the whole reason we're dealing with emerald ash borer, we believe, is because people kept moving firewood. So back when this emerald ash borer was established, I believe it was in the upper Midwest. I believe it was Wisconsin, it might have been Michigan. They had this one area, it was a quarantine zone. And what happens with the emerald ash borer is once it kills off those trees in that area, if it doesn't get to new trees, it dies out. The population collapses. And so they wanted to establish this quarantine zone, this ring, where they got rid of all the ash around where emerald ash borer was. And so as long as the emerald ash borer was not moved outside of that ring, they thought they could contain it and the population would just kind of go away. Well, people just kept moving the firewood past the quarantine zone, and they kept trying to they expand that quarantine zone too fast that they never got around to getting rid of emerald ash borer. And here we are now dealing with emerald ash borer throughout all basically the Northeast. And it's kind of sad that that's what caused it. But so I camp a lot and never move firewood, never ever move firewood. It's not worth it.
Don't move firewood. It bugs me.
Yeah, to no end. Seriously, I like that pun. I might have to steal it for a future talk. All right, thank you, Michelle. All right, thank you, everyone. And I have my information at the bottom. Again, you can always feel free to contact me. Thanks for showing up. Thanks, North and South Rivers Watershed Association, for having me. Thanks, Mass Audubon. I hope you guys have a great night.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks so much, Blake, and thanks everyone for joining. Like I said, a guided walk will be coming up. If anyone has any responses to Blake's question, how can we be better friends to the insect world, please feel free to email those submissions to me, and we might highlight a couple more for next week's talk. So next week's program is going to be at the same time, Wednesday, 7 o'clock, and it's actually going to be hosted by Doug and myself once again, but our guest speaker will be Kristen Kibblehouse with the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. So session 2, Awareness Inspires Conservation regarding Atlantic white sharks. So please join us once again, and a really special thanks to Blake once again, just a fantastic speaker, and your enthusiasm and your passion are always just captivating, and we can tell that you really love what you do, and we really love hearing you talk about what you do and learning from you. So thank you very much once again for joining us. With that, we will sign off for the night. Thanks again, Doug, and thanks all of you for joining us. We will see you next week at this time. Thank you very much, and I will be signing off here. Have a good night, everybody.